Rupert, welcome to the All Things Risk podcast. This is a pleasure. This is actually the highlight of my day. So wonderful to speak to you. Wonderful to catch up. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
So as a bit of background, I think we're going to get into some really interesting stuff. Your book is fantastic, by the way. It is very fun. And your experience that you bring to this problem of ethics is quite valuable and very different. But before we get into that, I'm just wondering if you could give a little bit of background as to who you are and what you do, or at least how you describe that to people. And I'm always after the people that struggle to answer that question well and have answers that might go on for a little bit, but that's always, I think, a good sign. So anyway, how do you answer that question? What do you do, Rupert?
That's a great question, and it depends who's asking it, because sometimes I feel a bit of a jack of all trades. But I guess in sort of the normal strap line would be, if you're talking about output, it would be kind of risk assessments, program implementation, and some investigative support. But if you're talking, that's obviously very sort of tactical stuff. If talking more conceptually, I'd say that what I do is try and make risk relevant to people, because so to give a practical example, I had a call this morning with an organization that's a fund operating across Southeast Asia, and I was speaking to some of the folks in Cambodia, and they're headquartered in Singapore, so they have all this regulation in Singapore. And so she was like, this money laundering stuff, we have to file all these reports with Ministry MAS, which is like the financial regulator in Singapore. It's all we do this training. It's not super relevant. So money laundering, corruption, what's it all about? And so they've already got this money laundering system in place. So I just asked her, I said, how long have you been working in your role, which is finance role, like managing the fund? And she said, 8 to 10 years. I said, how many instances in that time have you seen of money laundering? And she's like, none that I'm aware of. I said, and have you been living in Cambodia that 8 to 10 years? She said, yeah. I said, well, how many instances in your personal and professional life have you witnessed of corruption in that period? And she just laughed, and like every day. And I said, I think that's the challenge, is that some of these risks are very conceptual for most people because we don't butt into them on a daily basis. So my job is to try and make them relatable.
Okay. And we know each other from our days at Control Risks, which is a very interesting company, and perhaps it would be useful to just give a portrait around your career. Like, what did you want to do, and how did you get involved in this world of investigations? And someone still might be listening to this and say, well, what does that have to do with ethics? I don't make the connection. So if you could walk us through your career and what you aspire to do, and then how you got to doing what you're doing.
Sure. I mean, it's more of a kind of a leap and a stumble in terms of, rather than like some systemic walk, my career. So when I graduated, the course I was on at university, we were called BBA, Bachelor of Business Admin, and BBA 4 was the final year. And the joke was that Accenture was BBA 5, because 30% of my colleagues went to Accenture. And I kind of looked at I remember that all these management consultants and banks and accountant firms came down on the campus, and some of them would bring these massive buses with like sort of big computers inside. And I walked through these things, and I still had no clue what these guys did. And so I was a bit underwhelmed, honestly, by the opportunities. And then I saw one that was to do with risk, particularly counter-terrorism and analysis. I thought that sounds a lot more interesting. So it was just purely that sounded more interesting. It coincided with, it was 2001, so it was a kind of a career I don't think would have existed much before then. So I graduated July 2001 and then started around about October in this role. And I was working with a number of Control Risk alums in that organization, and we basically got subsumed as part of the big insurance broker Aon. So we were meant to be an independent consultancy and doing like everything high risk, so kidnap, political violence, kidnap for ransom, that kind of stuff. And then I became aware that it was going to be more skewed towards trying to support the insurance part of the business. So, like doing the terrorism analysis to support an underwriting thing for a power plant in Colombia or whatever. And that didn't appeal. And so these people I was working with, they said, have you heard about control risk, Kroll, risk advisory, Janusi, and all these folks. And so, yeah, sort of. And then I just started to kind of go for coffees with people to try and understand two things: what these organizations did and whether I would have a place in any of them. And so eventually I found a role that I might be considered for, which was due diligence and investigative stuff within control risk. And it was, honestly, it was a foot in the door. It wasn't my passion project to be working for initially in big investment banks doing lots of due diligence on their counterparties. But once I got the foot in the door, I just volunteered and stuck my hand up for everything, even if it wasn't within my job scope. I would just, even if I was just taking notes, I didn't care. I just wanted the exposure to as many things as I could, which eventually led through into more interesting investigative work, particularly after the 2008 crash, where there was a lot of asset recovery and litigation support. And then in 2010, I got the opportunity to go out to Singapore to build out the network of kind of sources, intelligence assets, essentially across Southeast Asia. And that, during that period, the 2010 to maybe 2013, the client demand really shifted from very responsive, reactive kind of investigations, crises, to more preventative stuff. How can we stop this from happening? And that was the genesis, I guess, of what Control Risk called its ethics and compliance consulting practice. But that's a misleading name, and it's basically, I would call it like more complex problem solving. So you get cases where there be, I don't know, a politician in a country in Southeast Asia threatening to cancel a license unless a bribe's paid. No one's really prepared for what you do in that situation, because that's a high stakes, powerful stakeholder. Or you'd have like somebody who claims they've got lots of sensitive US government data in a BPO facility in the Philippines, and they're going to release it unless certain extorted demands are met. So what all of these sort of slightly chaotic projects started to, I guess, review. I guess the theme I saw across a lot of them was stuff that would be very familiar to you, because it was your bread and butter, is most organizations don't have mechanisms to kind of calibrate threat. Is this credible? Is this not? How do I respond? How do I prioritize? And on top of that, most of them, it's changed a lot now, but at the time, most of them didn't go much beyond like the policy infrastructure for mitigation. So, they'd have an anti-corruption framework or a this or a that, but they didn't really think about risk resistance strategies, avoidance, alternate routes to market, how you de-risk your business by the partners you choose. And so that was where it started to get more interesting. And in 2019, I set out on my own because I think what I saw was that Control Risk and other big organizations like that are very well placed to service the FTSE 100, the Fortune 500, those type. And there's a lot of folks like that. But there's a huge strata of businesses underneath that, and organizations, and I work with third sector, I work with governments that don't have big internal teams, don't have infinite resources, but still face many of the problems, and perhaps more so because they lack the leverage and they lack the clout that some of the big organizations have. And so that's where I live now. I work with an interesting eclectic bunch of organizations who, I guess the thematic binding thing would be, is they're big enough for this stuff to be a real issue, not so big that they've got huge internal teams, but they actually care about doing the right thing. So a lot of the organizations I work with at the moment are based in Northern Europe, where they're very risk averse, but increasingly risk aware. Right.
Yeah, that's a very underserved area of the market. And I always found it whenever I was, for example, at Control Risks, working with a big multinational around corruption, right? So a big capital, an energy firm or a big mining company has huge clout, right? The amount of capital they're spending in a country. So then the message is always, well, we don't pay bribes, and that's it. And maybe some equipment gets held up at customs for a while at the beginning of the investment, but after that cloud is weighed, then things can proceed more smoothly. But if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, how do you deal with that? You're just at the mercy of the authorities.
Yeah, and increasingly you're also having a lot of that pressure kicked down the supply chain from the bigger companies to you. So there's I've seen these sort of, medium is maybe misleading, but let's call it for that. The medium-sized organizations, they're being sent these massive disclosures, whether it's to do with bribery, whether it's modern slavery, sustainability. They're all of these things where they have to evidence what they're doing. And I think it's very challenging. And that's where it comes back to making the sort of risk relevant, where it's helping people work out where to start. So if you're, I don't know, like if you're an agribusiness, let's say, and you're being asked to make sure that your supply chain is free of modern slavery, there's certain inputs where you're probably going to know the right questions to ask. There are others like, I don't know, PPE or, gumboots, you're probably not. So it's helping. A lot of organizations just get baffled with, because they genuinely want to do the right thing, but there's such an overwhelm of requirements. And then you overlay other risk factors that you and I might not specialize in, but are very germane to them. So, whether it be cyber or data privacy. So I sympathize. These organizations are facing an increasing kind of disclosure, regulatory, due diligence, whatever you want to call it, burden. And it actually distracts from them managing the risks that they are best equipped to do, and the ones that are most relevant.
And we're going to get into your book in a moment, but actually one of the things that came out for me is that a lot of this stuff is kind of gray. Like we can say we will, abide by the law, and that's fine. That's what every organization should aspire to do. But actually, when you think about what that means in some of these geographies, it gets really complicated. And if you're just someone in the center of an organization in London or New York or wherever, and you're sending out requirements, you might be setting up your people to fail because they may not be able to implement those requirements. And so maybe talk me through that in terms of that challenge, and then where something like a good investigation might come in to try to alleviate that or address it.
So I moved back to the UK about this time last year. So I've been away for 12 years, and I got advice from friends who made the move back to Europe to treat it as a move to a new country, which I have. And I think what you've just highlighted is the biggest dissonance that I've observed. When I was in Asia, I was mainly operating in frontier markets. And so the questions were very tactical. It's on fire. There's a problem. We've got to stop it. How? Now I come back here, and it's a bit more of that kind of, as you said, the person at the head office who's trying to maintain standards across highly disparate operating environments with very different risk profiles. And it's not just down to the location, it's what you do in that location. Is it manufacturing? Do you have to have a local partner mandated by law? All of these things add complexity. And so to your point about from the investigative work, you're right, it's a very good, I hadn't thought of it this way, but it's what informed me going back to do better assessments. Is what I realized is that if all of the investigative or crisis things that I'd responded to, in the overwhelming majority, it was poor decision making rather than somebody nefariously trying to subvert or undermine. And so most of the time, if they are doing something outright illegal, often they think they're doing it for the good of their employer or because they're fearful of losing their job, etc., etc. So then when I started to look at and I crowdsourced on LinkedIn like the ethical excuses bingo, which is very helpful because you can then start to group those ideas. And then I went back to look at, well, how do we do better assessments? And what I realized is that the majority of what is termed risk assessment out there on the market is a glorified health check of controls. It's a benchmarking exercise. It's not a risk assessment. Risk is three-dimensional, as I would see it. It's that external operating context, what you do, who you do it with, how you do it, like routes to market, when, so choke points or over-reliance or critical nodes and, the critical path, all that kind of stuff. And so if you speak that language, the who, what, where, how, it's a lot more easy to get good data out of people than saying what is the likelihood and what is the impact and all this kind of stuff. So so that the external environment, then yes, you need to have your internal controls. But the crucial bit was the cultural bit. And there's data, including various surveys, that indicate when we have these issues, investigative issues, the majority of time, so about 2/3 of the time, it's not a control failure. So it's a human action or override or inaction. And so that's a cultural problem, for want of a better word. So how do we assess culture? And my current thinking, and it's constantly evolving, is it's a function of knowledge. Do people know what to do, where to go, who to speak to? Have they identified people they could bring an ethical problem to? Is it an accessibility issue? So can that be done in a timely fashion? Are leaders actually willing to grasp the nettle and have difficult conversations and back them up and support their people when they withdraw from bids? Or is it an accountability issue? So is it the way the organization, yes, we have zero tolerance, we want 100% compliance, but we also want 30% growth in one of the most corrupt countries on earth. So you get that disjoint. Is there some sort of accountability issue, or is it trust? Is it I'm worried that if I speak up that I might face retaliation. I don't feel I can admit mistakes. I don't feel I can say I don't know. Those more psych safety type questions. And so when we start to do these assessments on these organizations, what you'll find is, the themes I'm seeing so far, they're not, when I say them to you, you'll be like, yeah, but of course, that's pretty self-evident. But knowledge is weakest the further you are from either your language of operation or from a computer. So, if you're you're out there business developing or just with your phone, or you're working in a factory, you don't have the time that you and I do on a laptop, and the person who's creating all the knowledge content is sitting on that laptop writing in their native language, which is invariably, the working language is invariably English for the most part. And so even if it's some of that, like, we translated our code into X number of languages, still a lot of the messages and the other more subtle ways that risk is communicated to people come through a language that isn't their first. So you'll see people so I did a recent one for a manufacturing company, and in places like Korea and France, where English isn't the lingua franca in their manufacturing operations, knowledge is very weak. Accessibility is an interesting one, because it can often be functional, where you think accessibility should be best, like places like HR and finance often have strong hierarchies that make it weak. Accountability is very interesting. The most savage data tends invariably to come from the regional or total head office. So people feel that the accountability is weakest the closer they are to the seat of power, whereas people on the front line sort of assume that, yeah, everyone must be accountable because I am. Because if they do something wrong, they tend to get fired, those frontline folks. And then the trust issue is super interesting. It's very organizational dependent, but you also have the cultural overlay, and that I find fascinating. So you're operating, say, in countries that might have near zero kind of single party states, suppressive media. And that's the environment the person's grown up in, where speaking truth to power or speaking out can have severe personal consequences. And then they join your organization, you go, hey, we've got a speak up framework. You won, we'll protect you. And they're like, yeah, of course you will. And so it's when we start to look at that data, that knowledge, access, accountability, trust, then it's a lot more helpful to understand who needs what in terms of risk, because it's not uniform.
And just getting into some of the excuse bingo thing, one that you always hear is, well, this is the culture in this part of the world. They give gifts, this is how business is done, etc., etc. Always a very kind of a common thing. And what's the response to that, and what is the reality on the ground in some of these places about that?
My response, often I get that most from the kind of washed up expats in those countries rather than the locals. So, the guys with the massive gold chains at the mining companies, that's the way it's done and full of points. And so that kind of, and with them, I just say, watch Mad Men. The things move on. The working culture that was tolerable within the lifespan of people who are still in the workforce is totally unacceptable now. So things move on, and you just look at the news and the Arab Spring and even the corruption crackdown in China. It's very interesting. It's targeting sectors that are are important to the middle class urban elite who maintain the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China. So, like pollution, healthcare, education, transport. So the food. And so I think that this argument that everything is stagnant and nothing changes, or that's the way it's always been done, is a weak one. The more problematic one, which you also highlighted, is that, but it is the way things are done now. And that is the way I don't think there's one uniform answer to that. To do that, I think you have to start to do your research. So I remember seeing a Japanese exec deal with that one really well. When we were working with a heavy equipment manufacturer in their subsidiary in Thailand. And we got that sort of, a lot of the construction firms, etc., expect a bung if they're going to buy our very expensive machinery. And then the guy just replied back going, well, who's number one in the market? And it was Caterpillar. And he said, are Caterpillar playing those games? And a number of ex-Caterpillar employees there like, no. Okay, so they're number one in the market, but they're not doing the things that you say are fundamental to our success. So there's a disjoint here. And we have to look at what that fix is, and maybe that fix is better market sizing and what is the addressable market that we can address cleanly. Should we be bidding for state and enterprise contracts, or should we be going for ones that are backed by I don't know, what bank, or so that then it prompts a more business focused discussion around how do we de-risk our activities strategically rather than just having this kind of fatalistic, it's the way things are done.
Yeah, I've spent some time in the Philippines. I lived there for a few years, and when you're describing that, it reminds me of I was at some kind of mining company association drinks thing, and I was talking to I think he was an Aussie miner. I can't quite remember, but he was comparing the Philippines to Indonesia, and they said, the problem in the Philippines is that when you pay a bribe, there's no guarantee that you get your service. Whereas in Indonesia, when you pay, you get what you've paid for. And it's just like, so things definitely move on. And as you say, I think most, with all the protests and things like that, people in those countries know what's right, know what corruption is. And so
most of them want to, that's an incredible generalization, but my experience has been, is the people who are most receptive to what I do are actually the local folks, because it's such a hideous bleeding reality on their life. Yeah. Like, if you're getting extorted just to get to see a doctor, that's horrendous. And so I think when a lot of the folks who, they will lose faith if it's a kind of do as I say, not as I do. But if there is genuine will within the organization to back people up when they say no. And that's really important. And that's why accessibility is so important to understand. So that, because I've seen way too many examples of the opposite, where the local employees do phenomenal things going above and beyond and never get any kind of recognition or thanks for it. So there was a company that sort of is involved in port operations and sort of maintaining various storage facilities at ports. And in India, in this particular state, the port authorities were notoriously corrupt. And this guy refused to pay repeatedly, and they basically detained him for almost 48 hours in some sort of, police cell, which he did at the behest of his employer. And his employer never kind of acknowledged that. And you're like, if you want to get people on side, you're asking them to take considerable personal risk, and in some occasions, but also there's a social risk to them. So if you gave the example of Indonesia, and I know in Philippines you have the barangay council, and Indonesia the bupati, which is that village level. So if you're operating in some project in a rural area, and the bupati wants to have the village chief wants to have their hand in the till, and you're working within that organization as a member of that community, and you're the one saying no, that's putting you in a difficult position, and the company damn well better back you up. And that's why I think knowledge is really important, and to understand the realities. But I appreciate in this heavily regulated world, the people at the head office don't want any kind of record of the risk realities, which then that's the frustration I find myself in, and why I love working with organizations that aren't listed.
Right. Yeah,
they can actually be more honest about this stuff.
Yeah, it almost seems like a lot of organizations that are listed, or the really large ones, what they're trying to do is pass some kind of audit or have a defensible, a mechanism to defend themselves, but they're not really doing things to actually mitigate the risk. They're doing things to mitigate the impact of an investigation or an audit, which seems it doesn't. We can talk about codes and things, but that does not match up with a lot of the value statements that these organizations put out there.
No, for sure. And that's why there's a kind of a cynicism. But and so with the book, and when I was talking about values and stuff, I wrote that a few years back, and now I would write it slightly different if I did it again, because I still think they have a place, but I just see so much cynicism, particularly in the larger organizations. And now I'm back in like headquarter land. The kind of what I had in mind with values is it's more like, you have a family. So I don't know what your experience has been, but if I tried to legislate every single possible thing that I do or don't want my children to do, it would be the Magna Carta. And so it's better to have what are our standard behaviors and so that's what I see as values. But again, they lose all potency if they are face values rather than
Let's get into the origins of the book a little bit. What prompted you to write this book, and why the title Bootstrapping Ethics? I guess we touched a little bit about that, for smaller organizations maybe, but there's a lot of good stuff in there that's relevant to organizations of any size. But where did this idea come from, and who's it for?
So when the publishers first started the discussion, they gave me a relatively, they basically said that there's the books in this space are for the most part they're, I guess, what you would call more like textbooks, so like ISO 9001 board, and so we prefer something that was more kind of designed like a handbook as opposed to a textbook, and I guess, and then they said, but you have a think. And at that time I guess my second year of running the business, and the business is bootstrapped, and I saw a huge kind of overlap between my life and the experiences of a lot of my clients, these people working in in-house roles. So we don't have infinite resources. We constantly have to kind of justify our existence. We have to be creative with resources, including how we communicate. I can't be out there sponsoring mega conferences like a control risk can. So you have to, every element of what we're doing has some sort of synergy and overlap. So I would try to think, well, these folks often are, most of the persona I work with often is like a solo contributor or maybe a very small team. And so can I write to that person who's a small team or one person within the organization or maybe a board of a very small organization or SME, and how might you kind of build up and bootstrap your risk, ethics, compliance, whatever you want to call it, framework, such that it's viable for you to run and fits your risk realities and who you want to be in the world. And so that was because I guess my problem was I see so much stuff about best practice. I'm like, what the hell is that? That's if you look at like the DOJ guidance, which often people will use as this is the hallmarks of effective compliance, or this is what best practice looks like. It's designed to be there as a framework. It's a bit like if in the high streets of the UK, what is best practice for appropriate security? Well, it depends. Are you a bank? Are you a charity shop? Are you a hairdressing salon? And this is the problem I saw with a lot of organizations, is they're given this one best practice thing without any kind of idea about how to nuance it to their organization. So, just common areas you'll be familiar with, like if you are, let's say you're a services company, like an accountancy, then you probably don't want to be spending so much time worrying about like human suffering and your supply chain inputs. But if you're selling cosmetic products, you do. And so I guess it's it's that bit that will be intuitive to you and I, because this is the area we've worked in. But what I realized is it's not always intuitive to everyone else, just in the same way that when I was trying to run my business, it sure as hell wasn't intuitive to me what marketing is, or admin, or what a proper accountant should do to help you out. I had no idea. I had to find by trial and error.
Yeah, so many good points there. I'm not a fan of best practice or maturity assessments or this kind of thing, because it assumes, there's an assumption there that everyone's kind of the same, and
they're not. Yeah.
They're not. The context is very, very different. Yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit about this. So you have a section in your book where you talk about zero tolerance. And I want to talk about zero tolerance. We never pay bribes, or we never do this, or it's just not a done thing here, so just don't even talk about it. So what's the problem with zero tolerance?
I think it's a semantic one. Like, I think saying that we are an organization that does not tolerate certain behaviors, like discrimination, harassment, that's obviously entirely legitimate. I think when it becomes zero tolerance and you're trying to export that internationally, that can mean lots of different things to different people. Does it mean that in all instances of non-compliance, we are going to respond to with extreme kind of prejudice? And the investigator in me is very nervous about that, because I've worked on, unfortunately, way too many cases where you don't get to, you think you know what probably happened, but you're not able to prove it. So I had to give an example. I had one of discrimination, harassment, but the person who had suffered the discrimination and harassment had left the business, and they made a complaint and then left the business as they were leaving. And they didn't want to speak to the people inside anymore. They've done with the organization. So that we had this person who probably did do something wrong, but we don't have the witness testimony and the evidence or anything at all to back it up. And so in that context, if you're saying we have zero tolerance to this or that, and you're then failing to act on things that might be widely suspected or widely known, you undermine your trust in how seriously an organization takes things. Secondly, if we're honest, there are certain things where if they had zero tolerance tomorrow, like facilitation payments, 80% of the world's businesses would fall over in terms of multinationals. So I remember being in a conference in Asia where a Danish organization had the courage to say, we're working towards zero tolerance. Like, we want to eradicate this, but there are instances where it's unavoidable, including where people's feel pressured, or they're going to face massive client penalties, and people do natural human things. So that's my second problem, is it doesn't exist in reality. Like, if I say to you, the UK government has zero tolerance of speeding, well, what does that mean? It means when you go 31 miles an hour in a 30 zone, they take your license away. So I think it's just a very problematic concept when it's not backed up and thought through. So, and most organizations don't enforce disciplinary things consistently, from my experience at least. And so I think you're just setting yourself up for failure with what is probably a good intention but poorly chosen words.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk a little bit about, you mentioned speaking up, and I think having conversations about situations or challenges is pretty valuable. And I presume that if you just say zero tolerance, then you might scare people away from saying, hey, I came across this thing, and what do we do here? And
exactly. And so are you familiar with Erin Meyer's work, like the culture guy? So her background was she'd sort of help with the post-merger or post-acquisition integration on cross-border M&A. And so she ended up writing a book about her experiences. And she has this sort of taxonomy of 8 different ways in which we communicate, and she sort of scores countries at an average. And of course, that's a generalization, but some of the sort of methodology is very helpful. Like, is it a low context or high context communication environment? What's people's comfort speaking truth to power? How do people like getting feedback? And we need to overlay a lot of these things across organizations, not just across the geographic culture, but internal teams will have very different cultures. If you're talking like a team of developers versus a team of, I don't know, business developers in pharmaceuticals, they might be very different people. And with one of to give an example of where this falls over to your point, I remember working on a project in Indonesia where the European headquarters had come over and they've done, they've done a very legally lecture like they do most of the time. The Department of Justice says that if we pay facilitation payments, we have to record it under the FCPA's books and records provision. However, the UK Bribery Act says they're outlawed. So this is, we don't want to be recording these payments, etc. And so the message, it was muddled. And the message that the Indonesian folks took, where they have a kind of a different context of communication, they were reading between the lines, was, oh, okay, you don't want us to write down these payments. And so what they then did was they set up a fraud scheme with suppliers, where suppliers would overcharge and duplicate invoice. Nobody was benefiting self-enrichment, but that black box scheme was then used as the slush fund to pay off the officials. So they'd taken the payments, the facilitation payments off the books and records. And then when the organization turned up and started firing people, everyone was really shocked because we were doing it for the company, thought we were following through. And so when you're trying to encourage people to come forward and speak up, there's a presumption that you've communicated your expectation clearly, number one, which often hasn't been the case. And secondly, there's often not enough consideration of, well, what is the right way for people to speak up in our organization and in the places we operate. So a better question sometimes might be, I have identified someone who I could speak to about an ethical concern. And ask your people that, because who they go to with that will differ greatly. Like someone in a very flat hierarchy, easy speaking truth to power, very direct communication country like, say, the Netherlands, might be very happy going to the head of a department and going, I've seen this, it's wrong. But you go into Vietnam, it's maybe a different situation. And so particularly if you're talking with junior employees, etc. So speak up doesn't work without multi-channel communication and and also being very clear about what the expected behaviors are and what's covered and what isn't.
And you also touched on something that I think is really important, back to the point about the disconnect between headquarters and subsidiaries. Is there's this sort of assumption, I think, that bribery and corruption happens with cash in brown envelopes and that it's very sort of direct, but there are probably loads and loads of different ways and schemes in which that can occur. First of all, what's the weirdest or the most interesting one or two? Have you got an example of something that was like really, this is just really interesting or creative?
Horrendous ones. I don't know whether your show comes with an X rating or not.
We could talk about anything. So
probably the most horrendous one was somebody basically it was a cross-border paternity test, getting a fake semen sample smuggled, and that supplier that was willing to do that then extorted for contracts from the senior manager who got themselves in trouble. So if you're looking for the most gruesome or obscure one, that would probably be it. If you're looking in terms of more clever ones that I saw was in Vietnam there was a boom from maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking about 2011 of these construction projects that exploded. And a lot of them are like white elephant sort of ghost towns on the outskirts of big cities. And the politicians or the local People's Committee who grant, they approve what can be built on land, because all land is state owned. The way they would get their kickbacks is that basically when the condos and everything were built, they would just suddenly end up living in them, but with no title, or the title would be held to some company. So to detect it, you essentially had to do surveillance and then go back and try and obtain property records that didn't exist. So you get like very long-term ones like that. Trying to think of other clever. Maybe something will come into my mind if we progress. What was the second part of the question?
I guess it was the most the most interesting or the most creative, or the ones that would I'm kind of just thinking about my conversation with Bryce Hoffman, who wrote this book, Red Teaming, and
yes,
and so this idea of red teaming is like thinking about, you know, how getting someone to actually poke holes in your plan, and I think when it comes to bribery and corruption, the question might be like, if I wanted to win business with this organization in a corrupt way, how would I do that? That's probably a much better way of going about it, of figuring out what your flaws are, rather than having loads of, you know, policies and training and controls and, you know, whatever else is common.
Yeah. No, you're right. Like, there's so I can also think of some examples of where the reverse has been used, where to avoid bribery and corruption, people have used very creative solutions which appeal to the emotional drivers of the other person. So there was an extortion attempt to do with a port in Thailand, where they were essentially threatening to revise the concessions such that it would be impossible for certain size vessels to turn in it, thereby making it largely unviable as a terminal. And so when we looked into the Port Authority, who was instrumental in this sort of extortion attempt, they were actually an elected body, and they had campaigned on a Go Green initiative that they'd then done nothing about. And the organization I was working with also had a very strong kind of Go Green initiative because they were from the Nordics. And they struck this deal where they said, we'll change everything, you know, like making the diesel cranes electric, all that kind of stuff. And then you come down, the Port Authority, you take the photo op, take credit for it as if it's your thing, it helps with your re-election, and then just go away and stop extorting. So I have seen sort of creative responses to corruption by appealing to people's, you know, but in terms of the mechanisms through, I mean, a lot of nepotism, of course, gifts and entertainment, hospitality, all that kind of stuff remains endemic. I had an example that just popped into my head that's gone again when you were speaking about your red teaming point about, there was in the healthcare sector and in pharmaceutical and medical device sales, there's obviously quite a lot of corruption, and there was as the prohibitions rolled, we'd see increasingly creative things. So you would get, like, the first one was obviously no gifts, then it became no taking them out to expensive meals, then it became the targeting of the marketing and the symposiums and the speaking engagements, paying them egregious amounts to translate promotional material. Yeah, and so they just kept coming up with more ways to pay off doctors. And then the sort of the zenith of that was the doctors started charging, in one instance that I worked on, $5,000 per half hour to demo a product in a theater in the hospital. And you're like, well, if you're selling like some heavy, massive bit of equipment, very tenuously, you could make probably the world's worst argument for it. But when it's like pharmaceuticals, how do you demo that? So you take the pill out of the thing and you place it in your mouth. You know, I mean, so it was I think that people will always come up with ways to circumvent, but I think that probably I can't think of an insanely creative one off the top of my head.
No, it's okay. Even some of those examples I think they give enough flavor for the point that you make, you know, in the book, that you really need to understand what happens on the ground, and just having a bunch of policies and a code and things like that is not anywhere near sufficient.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. I'd like to talk a little bit about conflict of interest, because and this might be something that's relevant to some of my listeners, not to say they've got conflict of interest, but definitely it's something that, you know, I've had this podcast for many years, I've been employed, I've been I've tried to be very careful around not having anything that was could be perceived as being a conflict of interest. But with side hustles, with more people working from home, with things like that, it might be a gray area for people, and maybe someone who's listening to this might be thinking, I'd love to do this or to try this side hustle, but I don't know if I'd be sort of allowed, or maybe someone who manages a team or runs a business, how to deal with some of those things. So it might be useful just talk a little bit about what conflicts of interest are and how to, some of the best ways to address them.
Yeah, so the way they're typically messaged in most of the code of conducts I see is in this sort of slightly legalese, impenetrable, the things that conflict with your duties and the best interest of the organization, which is with conflicts of interest of all of the areas that I work in. On the one hand, it's the most simplistic. It's like, and anything you're doing outside of your salaried role that could potentially either distract or compete or cause reputational or other embarrassment. And so the best way to deal with it is to give examples and then get people to kind of discuss them, because then you can also, it should be a two-way street with conflicts of interest. So to get away from the kind of theoretical into practical, I think we, as employers or people running organizations, we need to be honest about the realities of our workforce. So if you are working in a very kind of a business where you can't afford to pay people handsomely and where margins and stuff are tight, then I think you need to think honestly about, well, what are the acceptable other things that people could do to earn income and just but the broad overarching point with all conflicts of interest is it's about a disclosure is key. So having that discussion about rather than kind of going ahead and doing stuff. And I've spoken to a number of our former colleagues about it, who particularly a colleague who worked a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, where people will take on multiple jobs and help out in family businesses in certain situations, and the setting she was working in. And she said she just talked about unburdening, secrets and talked about it less in terms of conflict, which is obviously very charged language potentially for folks. And so the other thing is we've got different generations coming through who have a different attitude to things like side hustles, to confidentiality, to other things that have been held sacrosanct by previous generations. And we have to have that discussion. And obviously I'm running a business. My feeling on it is that it's very hard to be a total hard and fast that's immutable forever. It's something that we have to discuss as new things evolve. So you pointed out work from home, you pointed out side hustles. So, giving something. So in the past week, I've had conversations with two folks who one's just left, but they were both in-house, and their side hustles respectively were pottery and soap making. And very difficult to imagine how that could possibly conflict with their roles. But then when organizations become very sort of thou shalt tell us about everything you do outside of work, it's also quite invasive. And that's the other bit that I think we have to be a bit mindful of, is because you'll often have people at the senior levels in the organizations who might have other board appointments, and there you are saying to people, you've got to tell me exactly what you're doing in your personal life. You're like, hang on, this person's getting paid like 6 figures anyway, and now they're taking a bunch of non-exec things. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but with conflicts of interest, I think we have to talk about the specifics of what your industry is, what it does, and also to your point about red teaming, I think sometimes conflicts of interests throw up some very good red team. So two examples that spring to mind were I spoke to an in-house counsel of a tech firm in the Middle East recently, and she explained that they found an employee of theirs was working full-time for an employee of another tech company. And so to me, that would suggest that the person is underutilized, because they were hitting all their targets. It wasn't that they were absent and all this kind of stuff. So yes, obviously they've done something naughty, but that's also a you problem. Like you're probably not utilizing your folks. Secondly, if you've got people within your organization who you're paying to be super creative and come up with great ideas, and then you're saying all of your ideas are entirely ours, well, that's hardly collaborative. So I see some tech organizations start to do incubators where they might in time give the employees a stake in that. And so that's where I think you have to be a bit more nuanced. If you want to encourage that creativity and people to stay within your walls and be creative, then you have to give them an incentive to do so. And I don't think it's a strong one to say all IP you ever create, even if it's nothing to do with the training we provide you and all came from your head, that's ours and sod off. That's not particularly collaborative. And the other example that sprung to mind was there was a Japanese organization that did they had like sophisticated niche equipment that would go into manufacturing and other things, but they were very rigid about servicing hours, like a 9 to 6, Monday to Friday, or whatever it was. And so they found out a number of their engineers were moonlighting because things often break down at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. And so their concern was, well, if that isn't properly maintained and it results in injury, then we could potentially be liable. And you're like, that's a legal way of thinking about it, and it makes perfect sense. But a better question is, we're missing out on a market opportunity that clearly some of our employees are willing to capitalize on. Do we need to rethink? So I think conflicts of interest is a good discussion to have, because it will expose things that you're not doing or you haven't thought about very well within your organization, apart from anything else.
Right. I also wanted to touch on some of the dark arts of investigation a little bit.
Okay.
And when people think about investigations, it does feel a little bit like you talked about things like intelligence assets and stuff like that. And but I think your book also talks a lot about what that actually means in terms of doing investigatory work, and it could be around an ethics issue, or it could be something else. Yeah. But just talk to us a little bit about what goes into a good investigation, and maybe even dispelling some of the myths that this is all sort of work in the shadows and CIA, operatives and this sort of thing.
No, yeah, not happily. So the proactive intelligence gathering stuff is very, in simplest terms, it's going out there and doing whatever public domain research you can, which is, yes, maybe it might include some deep web stuff, but people love to overplay that. Essentially it's people they've got knowledge about like corporate registries and litigation and county court judgment, whatever it is. So you go and look for information to build up a profile. And let's say I was doing it on you. The first place I go is LinkedIn, and I see all the places you've worked. I see the roles you've done. I'll check on Companies House to see what directorships or shareholdings or anything you might hold. Then I'll look for, well, who worked there at the same time, who were the clients, potentially investors, whatever it is, who would be the stakeholders for you in those roles. And I'm just putting those names into a spreadsheet, and then I'm writing next to those names what sort of questions they might be able to answer. So let's say, one of your roles relate, you gave the example of Philippines and mining. Let's say I wanted to, I was considering you as a non-exec director for a new mining company. So I'd heavily skew towards there, and then, well, what exactly was Ben doing? What's what did his colleagues and clients and stakeholders have to say? And then you're just collating that information and trying to cross-check and cross-verify so that you're not single sourcing anything. So it's that sort of, and that can be purposed towards, looking at people's assets or litigation support, or it can be, or even like private equity, they would often do it towards, they ask good questions like, well, of the founders in this organization, who's got the supplier links, who's good at the marketing, who was the one who took them in this direction, and so that they have business related questions. So you can just think of it as like a reference check-in almost, and then it demystifies it a lot. You're just trying to find people who'd be able to answer the questions about whoever it is you're looking into. So that's the proactive stuff. The reactive, so when we think something's gone wrong, or we know something's gone wrong, then my experience has been is that if you're a hammer, all you see are nails. And the problem with investigations is often people will just default to whatever their specialism or their favorite way of doing things is. So, if you're a cop or an ex-cop who's done a lot of surveillance work, you'll be, surveillance is the way forward. If you're a forensic accountant, it's forensic accounting. If you're IT forensics, so we've got to pull everything off a server. And the best example I saw of where investigation, a smart investigative strategy was that back in 2006, with a former colleague of ours, Dane Shimura, who's a mentor of mine. And there was at that time in China, a lot of organizations were, they had to partner with local partners, and there was concerns about those local partners ripping out IP and setting up duplicate businesses, particularly in manufacturing. And so this was the concern of this particular client. We think that our business partner has set up a competing sort of entity. And so the people around the table, they were, oh, we can do the surveillance, or let's get down to the registry and see if he's incorporated any other companies. Oh, but that might trigger the authorities, or maybe we need to look through the books, see if he's pulling money out the company. And everyone's defaulting to their nail. And then Dane was just quiet for a while, and then he just like, or we could just get the guy's business card. And the client was like, well, but then what? We show that they've got a business card for this new business they've set up. He goes, you're not going to win a court case against them in China. You're not going to get any damages back. So your objective for this investigation is to find out what's actually happening, and then you can look at your business continuity and exiting that relationship, maybe finding a better partner, and also some sensible suggestions like make sure your management are actually on site, not in some glossy condo in Shanghai with your factories 3 hours away. And so that's, to my mind, what a good investigator does is more and more, I think they're a quarterback, because you have all these reports coming through, or for European listeners, like the football playmaker. So you have the reports coming through where you have to assess the credibility, the verifiability, the materiality. So, could it happen? Would we be able to determine if it happened? I.e., where might the evidence sit? And how critical is this? And then you look at the answers to that, and then you think, well, what are the best investigative tools at my disposal? And when should we be confronting people? When should we be bringing in witnesses? And you have a plan, and that's that kind of quarterback role. So on the reactive investigations, I think the most underutilized role is that quarterback role. I think I see a lot of organizations go, oh crap, investigation, and then they just send it out to whoever their external provider is, often the Big Four, and then they deploy the resources they always deploy to it, rather than having somebody going, well, what's our objective here? What do we actually, if we prove this, what happens then? And then think back from that point, and then structure your investigation accordingly. So as you said, it's not massively mysterious. I think a lot of it's meticulous legwork, reading through disclosures, looking through emails, whatever it might be, is often a lot of drudge work. The glamorous kind of interview thing is never as it appears. There are a few books people should read on that if they're interested. One of them is Rapport by the Allisons, who are psychiatrists who were working with at-risk teenagers and then started getting called in by the US and the UK anti-terrorism authorities. And so they have a very simple model called a HERE model, honesty, empathy, the A, basically, I've forgotten what the acronym stands for, but it's giving the person agency, and reflection is the R bit. So that's a very simple model if you want to get into investigative interviewing. But I went away and did further studies in that area, so I can sort of, I'll stop there rather than kind of boring people with it, because it's a passion project. But it's something people should always be working at if they want to be good at it.
It's an interesting area, and as you were talking, one of the things that sprung to mind is, and I've got this, I'm thinking about decision making all the time, and it's just, well, what's the question? Like, what are you trying to? What's the objective? What are you trying to get out of this? And so I think there are so many, especially in this space of ethics, compliance, of risk. There's so many tools out there, but many of them are sort of kind of solutions without a problem. But what's the context, and so I think that's a really valuable point. Like, what are you trying to get out of an investigation, and based on what you learn, what are your options, right?
Exactly. And sometimes it goes against our human nature sometimes that actually, and it's that sometimes the best thing we need to do is correct and move on. So an example of that was I was working with the easiest way to think of them is like Amazon equivalent in Southeast Asia, and they were experiencing abnormal thefts of things like iPhones at their facilities. They have a lot of contract and temporary workers coming through, and so do we want to try and identify of their hundreds, if not thousands, of employees, which one pinched an iPhone and then throw the book at them? And that was the instinct of their risk manager. They wanted people to be accountable. But when you actually looked at how the fraud and the theft was occurring, There were just some very systemic weak points within the internal kind of way things moved around the warehouse. And I know it's a lot less sexy and a lot more boring, but let's just focus first on plugging those existing gaps that are causing the problem. I get that you probably want to find some people to set an example, etc. But the first thing, the priority to your point, is we want to stop this from happening. We already know how to do it. We knew that there were certain flows within the factory, particularly the loading onto the trucks, that were very weak and had poor CCTV and all kinds of other stuff. So that we know what some corrective actions will massively reduce that outcome. But do you really want to deploy hundreds of thousands of dollars of investigative hours trawling through everything to fire 4 people on minimum wage? Maybe you do to set an example, but that's your call as an organization. But so I completely agree. I think investigations are a very brutal examination of pragmatism often. Well, what is it that actually we need to stop to stop it from happening again? But also, what examples do we need to set? Those and what's realistic? So we prove that our supplier in this market is egregiously corrupt. So what? Well, what are we going to be able to do? Terminate them, find a new relationship? Sure. We're not going to be able to take it to the authorities. Therefore, if we're not going to be able to take it to the authorities, do we need to be gathering information to a court case evidential level, which is the default that most of the big advisory firms will operate to? No, we just need enough to know that it's happening. So what is the threshold of that evidence that we're happy with? So I think investigations prompt, to your point, if there isn't clear decision making about what we want to do or what the objectives are, they can be a colossal waste of time and money, which is why I think so many organizations have such a jaundiced view of them, which is a shame. Because my view is that everyone has failures, we all make mistakes, that's just part of it, and it's an opportunity to learn and improve and not do it again. Yeah,
absolutely. At the same time, you do highlight a few things that from your book that I think are really transferable from, I guess it's the world of investigations or just inquiry, that I think are useful to actually loads of disciplines, right? So one of them is just around questioning techniques and just how to get someone to kind of open up. I'm also curious about body language, and you've mentioned that, and I know you've done some work on that, and you can go on, you can try and figure out how to do some of this stuff from YouTube, but it's just like there seems to be a lot of bullshit in that space too.
Absolutely.
It's like, this person, he scratched his left eyebrow, and that means that he's clearly lying, or this sort of thing. So maybe just touch on both those quickly.
Monumental amount of bullshit in that area. So the questioning techniques, there's numerous models. The peace model is a good one. It's developed by the UK police after a panorama investigation showed that they were interrupting suspects and witnesses on average 7 seconds in, so that the person never got a chance to actually tell their story. So that's just or conversation management techniques. There's various tools out there, but the key thing is, it's impossible to do any of the deception detection without some form of baseline. You don't get a baseline by just launching in and interrupting people. You need to sort of establish their normal patterns of behavior. So to your point about the scratching thing, I don't know if you remember a former colleague of ours, Andy Gilham. He always would stroke his sideburn. It was just like one of his idiosyncrasy. We all have these, one of his patterns of behavior. And so some people will think that that's a grooming gesture, or there's some bullshit. If that's the person's baseline, that's their baseline. I had another colleague who would often wrinkle their nose, which can be mistaken for disgust. And she wasn't showing disgust every 3 seconds, although her employment conditions weren't magnificent. But again, my point is, go back to hammers and nails. All of this stuff is a tool. So if someone rocked up to say, Ben, I'm going to build you a house, and they've just got a few planks of wood and a hammer, you'd be like, you wouldn't be filled with confidence. So somebody who comes to me and goes, I've got the method for detecting deception, and this is my one-trick pony. Like, no, start off. There are people leak differently. So to give like popular examples, we saw, when Bill Clinton was doing his "I did not have sexual relations with that woman," Mr. Folksy, Mr. Yall is suddenly changing his verbal patterns considerably, and that woman distancing language, sexual relations distance. So you could be like, okay, so he's using a very different lexicon than he might otherwise. That's interesting. Whereas there was a senator called John Edwards who had an affair with his nanny, and while he was talking about, happy to take the paternity test, he was just doing the slightest head shake to the left. So then he kept all of his vocals were in check. He was smiling. So basically, we leak our emotions across 6 channels, and it's very hard for us to be in control of them all of the time. So where that leakage will seep the truth will differ depending on the context, who's on the other side of the table, our views towards them, our level of comfort, whether in physical discomfort. There's so many variables, which is why I go back to the fundamental thing. We have to have a baseline for that person in that context. And then we can start to look. And once we see sort of 3 deviations from a baseline across 3 different channels of communication within a 7-second space, then that's interesting. That's inconsistent. But they're always... We then have to have good questions and hypotheses for why is that inconsistency there. So to your point about body language, it's the one that's most written about, but it's least universally reliable because there's a heavy cultural component to it. Like you've just got back from a cycling trip to Italy, there's a cliche of Italians using hand gestures a lot, for example. So what are we meant to read into that if we're body language analysts? And I've seen the books about, their feet were pointing towards the door, it means this, or they looked up to the left, it means that. Maybe in time, I'm not doing research studies on this, and it is very difficult to do research studies on human deception because you need to have realistic lying, if you know what I mean. And it's quite difficult to create the lab conditions with the stakes of realistic lying and the fear of getting caught that we have in the real world. I'm sure there are studies ongoing that will continue to reveal certain things, but I would be staggered if anyone finds a Pinocchio's nose, like one way that all humans leak deception. So I think that anyone peddling that is a huckster, it's bullshit. Right. We leak differently depending on the context and who we are and how we communicate.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I knew you were going to say something about having a baseline, and so it's so important. It's so hard, right? You have to spend lots of time with someone. The thing about the Bill Clinton thing is we've heard him speak, so many times, and so you could actually make that. You could see there's a deviation, but if you're going in, you've never met the person. I don't know how you would detect that.
It's very challenging, which is why I would always go back to the boring basics. Prepare well, have all of the evidence that you can before you get into the room, ask good questions, and just observe and listen. So the number of times that that kind of movie scene, aha, I've got you thing, it's very rare in your also because in a workplace investigation where you often you don't have sort of much power, bluntly. You can't compel them to be there, you can't detain or anything like that. So you have this short hour or whatever with the person, and then you have to kind of look back and discuss with your co-interviewer what inconsistencies, But I guess the bit that I have a bias towards the words and what's said. The thing I will find interesting, and you have to overlay the familiarity in whatever language you're communicating and their level of kind of literacy and fluency, it's that lies, and I'm sure you would have seen this with small kids, they tend to be rehearsed on a very straight track, and they tend to go like that. Whereas the truth is like spaghetti. When we're recounting a truthful story, we can jump in and out to any point because it happened. And we can describe things like contextual details. We can embed things that aren't relevant. Oh, it was a nice day, but even if that's entirely irrelevant, we will describe interactions between people that we overheard because we're not trying to replicate what 2 other people might have said. When it's a lie, unless you're a very skillful liar, it becomes quite hard to set that whole scene where you have all the cast and everything around you operating in the way that they would in a normal story. So if you're a good interviewer, you can take people in and out at different junctures of the story, and if it's truthful, they'll be just happy to go back in wherever it is. If it's a lie, they will get disoriented. Right.
Okay, so fascinating. Look, I'm conscious of time, and I do want to wrap up. For people that have listened to this and they're really interested in your work and want to know a bit more, I guess first of all, how do you work with clients? What do you help them with? What types of things might they come to you with?
That's a really good question. I guess there's sort of two broad streams to it. There's on the organizational side, there's a fair amount of assessment work, whether that be external risk assessment, looking at what they're doing inside, but also the cultural bit, and then the follow-on kind of implementation and adaptation support. There's obviously some of the intelligence and investigative work as well, particularly that kind of quarterback role I was talking about. So that's the organizational side, but increasingly I'm also starting to work with people within the organizations to help kind of upskill the risk familiarity, for want of a better word, because a lot of people who come into the in-house roles, they come from maybe a legal, finance, and other background, and so getting people up to speed with how to properly calibrate risk, how to make it relevant to people, how to communicate it, how to get the senior leaders on board with it rather than it being just some blocker. So there's two streams, the sort of B2B and then the B2C side, I guess.
Okay, fantastic. And so the book is called Bootstrapping Ethics. And what are some of the best places to get in touch with you, follow you? I know you're active on LinkedIn and you've got a newsletter,
yes,
all that good stuff.
Yeah, so the LinkedIn's probably easiest. On my bio, there's LinkedIn have recently changed it, but it's like just underneath the intro bit, opened, where is it? Visit my portfolio, I think they call it now, which is just a grand term for a link tree where you can find the newsletter, you can find the book, and there's some other free stuff in there. Like there's on the website, there's some white papers and that kind of stuff. So yeah, if you want to do the tire kicking and find out a bit more, I think LinkedIn is the best place to start.
Fantastic. I'll put all those links in the show notes. This is great. I think we covered a huge amount of ground. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And
well, thanks.
Let's stay in touch and wish you all the best. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rupert.